At the heart of the village sat a modest church with a crooked bell tower, always leaning just slightly to the left, as if listening. And beside it, the market square Legion, a quiet village where the river never sleeps. An old miller guards a secret older than the stones beneath his feet. Whispered among the villagers is a story of a lonely man who promised to protect the mill and keep its wheel turning no matter the storm. On foggy nights, a lantern's glow dances through the mist, a gentle reminder that some promises never fade. Follow Eli's journey as he uncovers the magic hidden in the hum of the wheel, the murmur of the river, and the soft light that guides the village through darkness. Before you settle in, take a quick moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy the stories I share here. This space is for curious minds, thoughtful souls, and those who love a good tale well told. And hey, drop a comment below to let me know where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. It's always a joy to see this little corner of history bring people together across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe switch on a fan for that soft, comforting background hum, and let's gently ease into tonight's journey. Your eyes flutter open before sunrise, not because you're disciplined, but because you're anxious. You're the orchestrator of tonight's elite Roman gathering, the one behind the curtain, pulling strings, managing egos, and praying the peacock handler actually shows up this time. There was once a quiet little village, nestled between low hills and dense whispering woods, the kind of place most travelers pass through in a day, never giving it a second thought. The trees here leaned gently toward each other like old friends, and the river moved slowly, never in a hurry, as if it too had settled into the rhythm of the village. The air smelled of soil and smoke and something faintly sweet, like dried hay. The seasons moved gently through the land. Spring brought yellow flowers that peeked through the thawing earth. Summer meant days so still you could hear bees from the other side of the field. Autumn turned the village into a golden painting, and winter crept in silently with its blanket of frost and long, dark evenings. The village itself was simple. Stone cottages with thatched roofs, leaning just a little this way or that. Chickens wandered freely across the dirt paths. Goats bleated from behind woven fences, and every now and then, the distant clink of a blacksmith's hammer echoed softly across the valley. People here knew each other by name. They shared tools, traded eggs for bread, and gathered in the square every Sunday for stories, song, and stew. Life was not easy, but it was known, predictable, safe. Used a widened space where a few carts gathered, offering turnips, wool, and the occasional meat pie. But not all corners of the village felt quite so warm. If you followed the dirt path out past the orchard, beyond the last grazing field, you'd reach the river. It narrowed here, gaining speed, and along that bend stood the old millet's wide, wooden wheel groaning under the weight of the flowing water, its stones forever grinding grain brought by villagers. The mill was tall, its roof steep, its boards dark with age and damp from the river's mist. The sound of the wheel never quite stopped. Even at night, when the rest of the village lay still, the slow churn of water and wood could still be heard. Some said it sounded like breathing. Others thought it sounded like the groaning of something trapped beneath. Next to the mill, separated by a low stone wall covered in moss, was the miller's house. It wasn't much to look at, just another timbered cottage. But unlike the homes in the village square, its windows were always closed. The shutters stayed drawn even on the brightest days, and no smoke ever rose from its chimney. Though everyone knew someone lived there, the children were the first to notice something was different. They would dare each other to run up and knock on the mill door, or to peek through the cracks in the fence. They'd return wide-eyed, giggling nervously, speaking in hushed tones about how the garden grew weeds taller than a man, or how the scarecrow in the corner hadn't moved in years but somehow always seemed to be facing the road. Their parents would hush them quickly. "Don't speak ill of the miller," they'd say. "We need the mill." And it was true. The mill was the lifeblood of the village. Without it, there would be no flour, and without flour, no bread. Each family brought their grain to the miller, and each time they left behind a small portion of it. His fee, quiet, unspoken, never questioned. But no one ever saw the miller weigh the grain. No one saw how much he kept or how much he returned. And yet, no one complained. Not really. They needed the bread. Sometimes, people would say things like, "I think my flour sack came back a bit light today," or "Didn't I bring 2 baskets instead of 1.5?" But they would say it quietly, without bitterness, as if trying not to draw attention even from themselves. There was something about the mill and its keeper that inspired, not fear exactly, but caution. A sense that one should not get too curious, that it was better not to ask too many questions. In the evenings, the villagers would gather in their homes, light candles, and sit by the fire. The elders would tell tales from the old days, stories of wolves in the woods and willow, the wisps in the marshes. But occasionally, someone would glance toward the eastern edge of the village, toward the dark line of trees where the mill lay hidden, and their voice would lower just a bit, and still life went on. Fields were plowed, babies were born, the river flowed, the mill ground the grain. The miller stayed quiet, and the village, wrapped in mist and habit, slept soundly most nights, while the rest of the village welcomed the sun each morning with stretching limbs and yawning doors. The mill remained still, always still. The water wheel turned. Yes, it never stopped turning, but the house beside it stood as if frozen in time, like a painting where the brush had run dry just before the details were finished. People often wondered when the miller slept, or if he did at all. He was rarely seen during the day, and even then, only for a moment perhaps, when opening the mill door to drag in a sack of grain, or when standing by the riverbank, staring into the water as if listening to something beneath it. His clothes were always the same, a heavy, mud-colored tunic, patched at the elbows, a thick leather belt, and boots that looked too worn to walk in, yet never seemed to change. No one remembered where he came from. The oldest villager, a hunched old woman with foggy eyes and a voice like dry paper, once said she remembered a different miller. Long ago, a cheerful man with a round face and a booming laugh. But that was a lifetime past. The current miller had simply appeared one winter, and no one had dared ask what became of the last. His house, if you could call it that, was tucked directly beside the mill, as if trying to stay out of its shadow. The wooden boards were weathered and damp, darkened by river mist and time. The thatched roof was thick with moss, and birds rarely perched upon it. The shutters stayed shut through every season. No candlelight was ever seen glowing from behind them, not even in the darkest nights of midwinter. And yet the miller was clearly alive. The grain still disappeared. The flour still returned. The wheels still turned. It was the garden that unsettled people the most. Not because it was unkempt, though. It was. Not because the fence leaned crookedly, or the soil looked dry, but because of what grew there. Strange plants, tall and tangled, with leaves too large for their stalks. Thick vines curled up rusted iron poles. Some villagers swore they had seen flowers bloom at night pale, waxy blossoms that opened under the moon and closed before sunrise. No one could name the plants. They weren't herbs nor vegetables, and no one asked the miller what they were. Children made up stories about the garden. One tale claimed that the scarecrow in the corner moved during storms. Another whispered that if you stepped inside, you'd lose all sense of time. A third told only in hushed tones insisted that a traveler once tried to steal from the garden, and the next day he was found wandering the woods without his shoes, unable to speak. Of course, adults didn't believe such things. Not really, but they still kept their children away. What puzzled the villagers most was how little they knew. In a place where every neighbor's life was an open book, the miller's pages were sealed tight. Did he eat? Did he sleep? Did he pray? Did he speak to anyone at all? Once, long ago, the village priest had gone to visit him. No one knew why. Perhaps he hoped to welcome the miller to Sunday service, or simply to check on his soul, as priests do. He knocked on the miller's door and waited. He waited a long time. Eventually, the door opened just enough to reveal a sliver of the miller's face. There was a short exchange, quiet words that no one else heard. Then the door closed. The priest returned to the village square, his face unreadable. He never spoke of the visit, but after that day, he stopped mentioning the miller in his sermons, not with judgment, not with scorn, simply not at all. Even the animals gave the place space. Cats never hunted mice near the mill. Birds never nested in its eaves. Even the village dogs, who were known for chasing carts and strangers, would lower their heads when passing the bend in the river. Still, the village needed him, needed the mill, so they came, one by one, each week. Farmers with carts of grain, wives carrying heavy sacks on tired shoulders, children sent to run errands, always returning a little faster than they left. They would knock once, leave the grain by the door, and return the next day to collect the flour neatly bagged, sitting exactly where they had left their offering, and always just a little less than expected. Some claimed it was just the nature of milling. You lose some in the grind, they'd say. Dust and chaff, it can't be helped. But others weren't so sure. They'd squint at their sacks, trying to remember just how full they'd been. Then they'd glance toward the house and think better of it. No one ever complained. Over time, suspicion became tradition. Children were taught not to stare at the mill. Adults gave wide berths. The miller's name was rarely spoken, not out of hate, but caution, like avoiding the name of a sleeping beast. Some villagers claimed he was just a man, perhaps strange, perhaps silent, but a man all the same. Others weren't so certain. And yet, through all the seasons, all the years, the mill stood, the wheel turned, the grain was ground, and the mysterious figure within the house, who walked like smoke, who worked like clockwork, remained. The villagers didn't love the miller. They didn't trust him, but they feared him just enough to leave him be. And so, the house by the river stayed quiet, always quiet, even when everything else in the village changed. The mill and the miller did not. The village mill stood like a great wooden lung, always breathing, always moving. The turning of its giant wheel had become a part of the rhythm of the land, like the chirping of birds in the morning or the crackling of hearth fires at dusk. Its creaking echoed gently across the riverbank, blending with the calls of distant crows and the slow ripple of water. It was easy to forget how deeply the village depended on it until one imagined what life would be like without it. The truth was simple. The mill meant bread, and bread meant life. Most villagers were poor. They owned patches of land passed down through generations, tilled by tired hands and bent backs. Every autumn, they harvested their grain, wheat, rye, barley, and stored it in sacks. guarding it like treasure through the long winter months. But grain alone was useless. You couldn't chew kernels and call it a meal. It had to be crushed, ground, sifted, and turned into flour before it could be kneaded, into dough and baked into the loaves that warmed every home. And for that, they needed the mill. There was no second option, no other place to go. The nearest mill outside the village was a 2-day journey by foot, through forests that whispered and hills that didn't always welcome strangers. So the villagers brought their grain to the edge of the river, always careful, always quiet. They placed it before the miller's door like an offering to something ancient and unseen. Then they walked away. No one ever knocked twice. No one waited for thanks. They returned the next day to find their flour neatly bagged, sitting in the exact same spot. But it was never quite the same amount. A little lighter, a little less. That was the miller's fee. He never wrote it down, never bargained, never explained. He didn't need to. The villagers accepted this silent toll like they accepted the weather. Some days you had a good harvest. Some days you didn't. Some weeks the flour felt generous. Some weeks it felt mean. But never did anyone refuse the exchange. Because without it, there would be no bread, and without bread, life would become something darker. There was a quiet kind of power in that. The kind that didn't shout. The kind that didn't punish. The kind that simply waited and watched. The miller never had to raise his voice. Never had to threaten or argue. He simply kept working, day and night. Through frost and flood, grinding grain as he had always done. And still, he was feared. Not because he did anything terrible, but because he didn't have to. The baker's oven could break. The blacksmith's hammer could chip. The shepherd could lose his flock to wolves. But the mill never stopped. And the miller never stumbled. It became a quiet joke among the villagers, though one rarely said aloud. If a child misbehaved, a mother might whisper, "Keep that up, and I'll have the miller weigh your soul." If someone was caught lying, they'd say, "Best hope the miller doesn't hear about that." It wasn't really funny, but people laughed anyway. Some claimed that the miller could tell how honest a person was just by the feel of their grain, that he could touch a sack and know if the harvest was earned, fairly or stolen in the night. Others believed he took more flour from those who had been cruel, and less from those who had been kind. No one knew for sure, but everyone acted just a little more carefully during the milling season, as if they were being judged, not just measured. Even the village elders, those who sat in council, who settled disputes and offered wisdom, ever questioned the miller. They spoke his name only when necessary, and even then, it came out gently, like a breeze brushing against an old wooden door. Once a traveling merchant arrived in the village, a confident man, sharp-tongued and clever-eyed, dressed in furs and wearing rings on his fingers. He brought silks and spices, trinkets from distant ports, and a loud laugh that bounced off the market stalls. He stayed 3 nights in the inn, sipping ale and sharing tales. On the 4th day, he asked the villagers why they all seemed to avoid the mill, why they left their grain at the doorstep like scared children. He laughed when they offered no answer. "He's just a man," the merchant said, "no different from any other. If he cheats you, tell him so. If he takes too much, ask for it back." The villagers said nothing. They simply looked toward the bend in the river, then back at him. The merchant, of course, decided to see for himself. He took a small sack of barley, just enough for a test, and walked down to the mill. Several villagers watched from the square, not following, but not entirely minding their business either. He didn't return until nightfall, and when he did, he was quiet. His steps were slower. His smile had vanished. He said nothing about what he had seen, or heard, or felt. He left the next morning, and the villagers never spoke of it again. The power of the mill was not in its size, nor in its wheel, nor in the grindstone within. Its power was in silence, in the way the village bent around it, like grass around a stone. It was the kind of power that couldn't be taken or broken, only obeyed. And so life went on. The wheat grew. The wind turned cool. The grain was gathered. And the people came, one by one, to the edge of the river, always careful, always quiet. And the miller watched. Or perhaps he didn't. But no one was willing to find out. The market in the village wasn't grand or loud. It didn't have brightly colored tents or merchants calling out over crowds. No silver coins clinked against marble counters, and no musicians played along the corners. Instead, it was simple. Just a few wooden stalls, some canvas stretched between crooked poles, and carts drawn by tired donkeys. The scent of fresh bread, smoke, and soil filled the air. A turnip here, a bundle of wool there, some candles, a pair of worn boots, and, occasionally, a string of dried fish. It was not a place for excitement, but for routine, familiar, predictable. That is, until the whispers began. They started quietly, barely more than a murmur between friends. A glance, a pause, a sentence that trailed off when others passed too near. Nothing bold, nothing loud, just a change in the air. It began with a woman who sold eggs, with her crooked smile and apron always dusted in feathers. One morning, she leaned over her stall and said to the man selling apples, "Do you think he ever sleeps?" The apple seller frowned. She nodded toward the bend in the road. The man laughed softly, unsure if it was a joke. He must, everyone sleeps. But that night, when he lay in bed, listening to the distant creak of the water wheel, the question tugged at his thoughts like a loose thread. Others began to wonder aloud. "I passed the mill at dusk," one boy said, "and saw the shutters open just a crack. I think he was watching me. I heard the wheel turn faster, just for a moment," whispered another, like it was listening. "I left 2 sacks of grain last week," a woman muttered, "and got back only 1. That's not dust. That's something else." Of course, no one ever said these things too loudly. The market remained calm on the surface. People smiled, traded, nodded politely. But under that calm was a stirring, a quiet unraveling of certainty. And so, the market changed. Not in what it sold, but in how people moved. They spoke more softly, stood closer, looked over their shoulders before saying certain things, and all the while, the wheel at the river turned on. The whispers took shape. Some claimed the miller had been a soldier once, a man who had seen war, who came back, changed, silent from horrors he couldn't speak of. Others said he wasn't a man at all, that no one had ever seen him age, that the wheel turned by its own will, and the miller was merely its keeper. There were tales that he didn't eat food from the village, but from the forest, that he trapped things under the roots, and brewed strange stews that smelled like earth and lightning. A few people said they had seen lights inside the mill late at night, soft glows that flickered like fire, but blue instead of gold. No 2 stories matched, but all of them grew. The strangest thing, however, was how the miller never responded. He didn't scold, didn't appear in the market to correct anyone, didn't leave warnings in flour sacks. He simply continued his work, silently, always on time, always precise. That silence, perhaps, was what made the whispers grow louder. If he had shouted, or argued, or defended himself, people might have let it go. But the quiet fed the mystery, like wind stoking hidden embers. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and the village prepared for night, the blacksmith's apprentice stood in the square. sharpening a blade by lantern light. A group of young boys had gathered nearby, trading stories. "I heard the miller talks to birds," said one. "He doesn't talk, he listens," replied another. "To the river." They laughed, not with cruelty, but with wonder, the kind that dances along the edge of fear. The blacksmith's apprentice looked up from his blade and said, not unkindly, "Best be careful with stories like that. He might be listening now." The boys fell silent. One of them looked toward the trees, toward the shadowed bend in the river. The sound of the water wheel, faint but steady, drifted on the wind. From that day on, the whispers changed again, not just about what the miller was, but what he might do. No one had ever seen him angry. But that was the thing, wasn't it? Not knowing what silence meant, not knowing what the wheel was grinding grain or something else, not knowing if the flour returned was exactly what had been given. And so, the villagers grew careful, not because they were sure the stories were true, but because, what if they were? They began to treat the mill not just as a place of work, but almost as a shrine. They left the grain in tidier bundles. They tied little ribbons around the sacks. Some even whispered small blessings or apologies as they walked away. In the market, people stopped telling miller tales during daylight. They waited for dusk, when the shadows stretched long and the firelight softened their words. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was respect, laced with unease, the kind of respect you show to deep water or old trees, or things that have watched the world longer than you have. The miller never changed, never spoke, never asked for tribute, never offered threat. But now, even his silence had weight, and the market, once only a place of barter, had become something else to a place where stories breathed between baskets and bread loaves. Whispers filled the air like smoke, and through it all, the wheel at the river turned, always turning. It had been many seasons since the last great storm, the kind of storm that didn't simply blow through, but arrived like a visitor with heavy boots, taking its time, knocking down fences and testing rooftops, as if reminding the village that peace was always temporary. It began with wind, not wild at first, just persistent, a long, low breath rolling in from the distant hills, carrying the scent of wet bark and churned earth. The trees along the river began to lean, their leaves rustling secrets. By nightfall, the clouds had thickened. The sky, once soft with starlight, was now a low ceiling of gray. The air pressed down, heavy and expectant. People hurried indoors. They latched shutters, secured animals, and pulled blankets close to their chins. Mothers touched their children's foreheads. Fathers checked the fires twice. Everyone hoped it would pass quickly. But the storm had no such plans. By midnight, the wind screamed. It pulled at doors and clawed at rooftops. Rain pounded like 1,000 fists against the earth. Trees groaned and bowed. The river rose, angry and swollen, its banks disappearing beneath its rush. And above the roar, louder than anything else, was the grinding wheel of the mill, still turning, still awake. Even in that chaos, it moved, creaking, groaning, steady and alive. No fire lit its windows. No figure stood at the door. But the wheel turned, as if it were part of the storm itself. The villagers lay in their beds, listening to the wind, to the rain, to the river, to the mill. And then it stopped. Not the storm, the mill. All at once, the wheel ceased its groaning. The sound vanished, replaced only by the hiss of wind and water. It was like someone had closed a door on a song mid-note. A strange silence followed, heavier than the storm itself. And just like that, the power shifted. When dawn arrived, it came slow and gray. The rain had thinned to a drizzle. Smoke rose from chimneys once again. Doors creaked open as villagers stepped outside to survey the damage. There were fallen branches, flooded paths, and soaked fields. The chicken coop near the edge of the forest had collapsed, and the baker's awning had blown into the square. But nothing was broken that couldn't be mended, except, perhaps, one thing. By midday, the whispers began, again more urgent this time, more pointed. It was the cooper's son who noticed first. He had gone to retrieve their grain sack from the mill's doorstep. His boots still wet, he carried a woven basket under one arm. But when he reached the edge of the river, the sack was gone. Not moved, not torn, not reduced. Gone. He came back, breathless, to tell his father. The cooper, a quiet man with weathered hands, frowned. He went to look himself, then his wife, then their neighbor. The mill door remained shut. No sign of footprints, no scattered grain, no sack. Soon, more villagers came to check their own deliveries. Most found their flour damp, perhaps, but present. But the cooper's sack, a full bag of barley one, they had stored carefully all winter, had vanished entirely. No one had ever reported a sack missing before. Undermeasured, perhaps late, once or twice, but never simply gone. The market filled early that day, not for trade, but for talk. They say the wheel stopped, said the candle maker, eyes darting. Only for a moment, someone replied, but I heard it too. Everything else was howling, and the wheel just quit. Maybe the storm did it, or maybe he knew the storm was coming. He, you mean the miller? They didn't say it loudly, but the name lingered in the air like smoke. The cooper didn't accuse anyone. He didn't raise his voice or pound his fists. He simply stood in the square, eyes on the bend in the river, his face unreadable. That evening, his wife left a small cloth-wrapped loaf at the edge of the mill's door. No note, no words, just bread, an offering, a plea. No one asked. The next morning, the loaf was gone, but the sack was never returned. That week, people stepped lighter. No more stories in the market. No more questions about the mill. Just short greetings and quiet work. But something had changed. The whispers had turned inward, no longer about the miller, but about what to believe. Was it just the storm? A gust of wind sweeping away the bag, the river surging high and swallowing it up? Or was it something else? The missing sack became a weight in the village's memory, a small invisible stone at the bottom of every basket, every barrel, every mind. The wheel, once background music to daily life, was now listened to more closely. Each creak mattered, each silence echoed. The miller never said a word. He was seen once that week at dusk by the shepherd's boy, who swore he saw the shadow of a figure standing at the window, tall, still watching the river. No one confirmed it, no one denied it. But they remembered, and when the next villager brought grain to the mill, she tied a blue ribbon around the sack. Just a little gesture, a kindness, a respect. Others followed. The mill resumed its turning, never late, never early. But something in the village had shifted. A storm had passed and left something behind. The villagers had known storms before, small ones, mostly. Winds that rattled loose shutters, rain that turned the footpaths to soft brown mud, thunder that grumbled far away like an old man shifting in his chair. But this storm was different. It began on a Tuesday. Not that anyone had been counting days too closely, but the baker's son remembered because he always helped knead dough on Tuesdays. That afternoon, the sky turned a dull gray, and the air felt heavy, as if the clouds were waiting to fall. The chickens didn't come out from under the cart. The goats stood still by the fence. Even the cats, who normally prowled along rooftops and stone walls, were nowhere to be seen. Then the wind began. It came not in a rush, but in long, slow breaths, the kind that bend trees without breaking them, the kind that finds its way through every tiny crack in every wooden wall, the kind that makes you think, maybe, tonight is not the night to leave the lantern burning too low. By evening, the rain had started. Not the loud kind, not yet. Just soft, insistent tapping like fingertips against glass, or the rhythm of an old lullaby played too slow. And over it all, as always, was the sound of the mill. The wheel turned, even in the early rain, even as darkness crept in. The wheel turned, steady, slow, familiar. Its groaning creak drifted over the village like a song everyone knew by heart. It was comforting in a strange way, but the storm had not finished arriving. By midnight, it had swallowed everything. The wind screamed through the trees. Rain came sideways, slashing against shutters. The river swelled, its edges vanishing in the dark. Lightning flickered like blinking eyes in the sky. And still, somehow, the mill wheel turned, until it didn't. It was sometime in the deepest part of the night, when someone, maybe the carpenter's wife, maybe the shepherd's boy, noticed that the sound had stopped. No creak, no groan, no rhythm, just wind and water and silence, and that silence felt strange. It wasn't long, a few minutes, perhaps, maybe less, but it was enough for the absence to settle like a stone in the belly. Then, without warning, the wheel began again, turning slowly like nothing had happened at all, but something had. In the morning, the village rose early. Branches were scattered across the square. A chicken coop had tipped over. The path to the well was soggy and torn. But these were the kinds of problems they knew how to fix. No one was hurt. No animals missing. No roofs blown away. In a strange way, they'd been lucky. And yet, the cooper's son, who had gone to fetch their flour from the mill, returned empty. His boots were still wet, his face pale from wind and cold. "The sack's gone," he said. They thought he meant it had been moved, perhaps slid behind the door or dropped near the stones. But the cooper, a quiet man who measured twice and spoke half that, went to look himself. There was nothing. No sack, no flour, no trace. Others checked their own. Most were still there, damp perhaps, but returned. Only one was missing. The cooper's. It had been a good sack. To a tightly woven bundle of barley meant for winter broth and bread. It had taken weeks to fill. He didn't raise his voice, didn't accuse anyone. He simply looked at the door of the mill for a long time, then turned and walked home. Later that afternoon, his wife, the woman who made willow bark tea for fevers, left. A round loaf wrapped in cloth outside the mill. No note, no explanation, just bread. By morning, the bread was gone. The flour never came back. That week, the village was a little quieter. People still spoke, still shared soup and fixed fences together. But there was something careful in the way they stood, something slower in the way they asked about the weather. No one blamed the miller, not out loud. But the story of the missing sack was repeated, always gently, always in whispers. It wasn't told with anger, but with curiosity, and maybe just a little unease. Some said the river had taken it, that the storm, rising high, had swept it away. Some said the mill had kept it, that a price had been taken for the stillness, for the silence, for the moment when the wheel had stopped. And some said nothing at all. But from that day on, villagers began tying small pieces of ribbon around their grain sacks. Some used blue thread, others used dried lavender or little bits of wool. not as decoration, not as a rule, just as something, a gesture, a sign of respect, a quiet way of saying, please, return it whole. And the mill kept turning, not slower, not faster, just steady. As it always had, it had been a quiet week since the storm. The trees had lost a few limbs. The roofs had shed a few tiles. But overall, the village was still itself soft, brown, ordinary. The kind of place where nothing truly exciting ever happened. And no one minded that much. The river was calmer now. It moved slower, like it too had tired itself out during the storm and was content to drift lazily by the bank. But on Friday, or maybe it was Saturday, no one was entirely sure, a fog came. It didn't roll in like it does in stories, like a creature crawling down the hills. It was just there. One minute the trees were visible, the next they weren't. The fog wasn't cold. It wasn't warm either. It was just damp and heavy and still. Sound moved strangely in it. The blacksmith's hammer, which usually rang clear across the square, now sounded muffled and close. Footsteps echoed in the wrong direction. A voice from a doorway might feel like it came from behind you. People didn't like to be out in it, so they stayed in. Windows glowed yellow behind wool curtains. Fires popped and hissed. Teapots steamed quietly. Only the cats seemed to enjoy the fog. Long shapes slipping through the white, vanishing and reappearing like smoke with paws. That night, the fog didn't lift. Even by supper time, when the lamps were lit and shutters closed, the thick gray mist held firm. The village bell rang once, twice, then stopped. No one could see the tower, and then the light appeared. It was the wheelwright's niece who saw it first. Her name was Lysa, 12 years old, with hair like field hay and a habit of staying up too late. She liked to sit by the window when the house was quiet, legs wrapped in a knitted blanket, forehead pressed to the cold glass. That night, she saw a lantern. Just one. Not from the bakery or the inn. She knew the shapes of those lights. This one was farther out, near the mill. It was soft and yellow, like candlelight. It bobbed slightly, as if someone were carrying it, not quickly, not slowly, just walking with purpose. She waited, eyes wide, barely breathing. The lantern paused once, just before the bend in the river. Then it moved again, around the back of the mill, and disappeared. She told no one. The next evening, the fog was still there, not thicker, not thinner, just the same. And the lantern returned. This time, she wasn't alone. Her cousin, Tomas, who usually fell asleep right after stew, had been sitting near the hearth, and she called him over. They both watched. The same yellow light, the same slow walk, the same curve behind the mill, and then nothing. They didn't speak, just went to bed and said nothing in the morning. On the third night, they brought their grandmother. She was nearly blind and very old, but she could still feel the room when it changed. She knew silence when it wasn't natural. So they helped her to the window, wrapped her in a quilt, held her hands. The lantern came again. The grandmother said nothing, only made a small noise in her throat. Not fear, not surprise, just a sound of remembering. And then she whispered, very softly, "He used to carry one just like that." Before they gave him the house, the children looked at her. "Who?" Tomas asked. She smiled gently, like someone being reminded of an old song. "The miller," she said. Before the wheel was his. By morning, the fog was beginning to lift. A little sun broke through near the fields. The stone path returned, bit by bit. The smell of morning bread drifted again across the square, but something felt different. Not frightening, not dangerous, just aware. The villagers didn't mention the lantern. not directly, but they began to speak in shorter sentences. They nodded more, questioned less. People who had once teased the mill or made jokes about it now simply said, "It's always turning," and moved on. The wheelwright himself, curious but cautious, left a new oil lantern by the edge of the river, not close to the mill, not touching the stone, just near enough to be seen. He didn't light it, just left it there, clean and dry. By the next morning, it was gone. No one asked where it went. No one went to look. But that night, Lysa watched the fog from her window again. No lantern came, just silence, just river, just the quiet creak of the mill turning, as steady as breath. And in the village, sleep came easier than usual. The village had many stories, stories that people shared quietly by the fire as night deepened, or whispered softly just before sleep, so as not to wake the listening shadows. But there was one story rarely told aloud, not because it was frightening or strange, but because it belonged to the mill and the mill belonged to the old miller. The old miller had lived in the village longer than anyone could remember. His hands were rough from years of work, and his eyes held a calm stillness like deep, quiet water. He spoke little, only when needed. People said he knew every secret of the mill, the way each stone and wooden beam fit together, every creak of the wheel, every whisper of the river nearby. But inside him, he carried a secret no one else knew. One afternoon, when the sun was low and long shadows stretched across the fields, a small boy named Eli found himself near the mill. He had been chasing a stray dog, but the dog vanished behind the stones. Eli stayed, watching the wheel turning slowly, the water splashing softly below. Then the old miller came out, carrying a lantern, even though daylight still lingered. The glass was dusty, the metal cold. Eli said nothing. The miller looked gently at him and asked, "Do you want to see?" Eli nodded. Together, they walked to the miller's small house, nestled just behind the wheel. Inside, it was dark and cool, smelling faintly of flour, old wood, and a touch of lavender. On a wooden table lay an old book, its pages yellowed and soft. The miller carefully opened it and said, "This is the story of the mill." He told Eli how the mill was built long ago, how the river had once been wild and unpredictable, and how the wheel had been silent for many years until someone came to fix it. But there was more, a story no one else knew, about the man who once owned the mill before the old miller, a kind but lonely man who carried a lantern, just like the one Eli had seen in the fog. And he left behind a promise to watch over the mill, even after he was gone, to keep the wheel turning and to protect the village from the river's fury. The old miller told Eli that sometimes, on foggy nights, the lantern's light was not just a shadow, but the old owner himself, still walking, still watching, still caring. Eli listened closely and felt the story settle softly around him, like a warm blanket. When the miller closed the book, the room was quiet. Outside, the river flowed steadily, and the wheel creaked gently. Eli understood then that the mill was more than wood and water. It was memory, care, and a quiet kind of magic. That night, as Eli lay in bed, he thought of the lantern in the fog, the wheel turning through the storm, and he smiled, because some stories, he realized, never truly end. They just wait. The morning after the fog finally lifted was unlike any other. The sun peeked shyly through the soft clouds, casting warm golden light over the village. The air was crisp, fresh, and filled with the subtle scent of damp earth and blooming flowers. The river flowed as usual, steady and calm, its surface shimmering like a sheet of glass. The mill wheel turned slowly, creaking in its familiar rhythm, as if nothing had changed at all. But everything had changed, just a little. The villagers awoke with a new quietness in their hearts, a calm that settled over them like the softest blanket. They spoke less hurriedly and smiled more gently. Children played with a gentler laughter, and even the animals seemed to move more thoughtfully. At the edge of the village, near the mill, a single lantern stood on the wooden fence post. It was clean and bright, glowing softly in the morning light, though no flame flickered inside. It was as if the lantern was waiting patiently for the next foggy night when its light would guide a wandering soul home. Old Eli, now a little older and wiser, walked slowly by the riverbank. He looked at the wheel turning, the river flowing, and the lantern glowing quietly. He knew, deep inside, that the mill and its stories would live on, not just in books or whispered tales, but in the gentle heartbeat of the village itself. Sometimes, when the wind was just right, he could almost hear the faint steps of the old miller's lantern bearer, still watching, still caring. And in that peaceful knowing, the village rested, wrapped in the soft embrace of history, memory, and quiet magic. The days grew longer and warmer as spring settled over the village, and life began to hum softly in every corner. The trees stretched their new leaves toward the sky, and wildflowers painted the fields in colors too bright to ignore. But even in the brightest days, there were quiet moments when the villagers felt the past brush against the present, like a whisper riding on the gentle wind. Eli, now a little taller and more thoughtful, often wandered down to the riverbank. Sometimes he would stop by the old mill, watching the wheel turn in the sunlight, its wooden spokes catching the light like little stars. One afternoon, as he sat beneath the leaning oak tree, he heard a faint sound, not the usual splash of water or creak of the wheel, something softer, like a sigh carried by the breeze. He closed his eyes and listened. It was as if the river was telling a story, one he hadn't heard before. The story of the miller's lantern, the promise kept through fog and storm, and the steady turning of the wheel that never rested. Though the voice was silent, the feeling was strong, a gentle reminder that some guardians never leave, that the stories we tell are threads weaving us together through time. Eli smiled to himself, knowing he was part of something much bigger, a story that stretched beyond the village, beyond the river, beyond even the turning of the wheel. And as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the fields, the wind whispered once more, carrying with it the quiet magic of the old miller's secret, forever alive in the heart of the village. As the seasons turned and the village settled into a gentle rhythm, the story of the old miller and his lantern became part of the very air itself. It was carried in the soft rustling of leaves, the steady pulse of the river, and the warm glow of evening fires. Eli, now grown, often found himself standing by the mill, watching the wheel turn in quiet meditation. He understood that the mill was not just a place or a machine, but a living memory, a bridge between the past and the present. One twilight, as the sky faded from pink to deep blue, Eli noticed a light flickering near the miller's old house. It was soft and steady, just like the lantern he had once seen in the fog so many years ago. He walked closer, feeling the cool evening air brush past him, and saw that the light was coming from a small lantern hanging on the porch. But this lantern was different. It wasn't carried by any person, nor did it flicker wildly in the wind. Instead, it shone with a calm and constant glow, like a beacon for all who needed a reminder that some lights never truly go out. Eli smiled softly, knowing that the miller's promise lived on, not only in stories and memories, but in the quiet strength of the village itself. And as the night deepened and stars filled the sky, the mill wheel turned on, guided by a light that would never fade.